Alan, say your thing.
And we're live.
Oh, hey, everybody. We've got Keith Sharon here from the Tennessean.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Keith.
Welcome.
He's the creator of the podcast Murder on Music Row. Thank you, Keith, so much for joining us. First of all, I'm a subscriber to the Tennessean. I appreciate.
Thank you.
No. It's my pleasure.
One.
We value. We understand the value of local journalism, and
there you go.
And yeah, it's it means a lot to me actually to be able to just have it as a resource, and that's a whole diversion. But me and Alan talk about that a lot, like the death of local journalism.
Yeah, and so do we in the office. I'm glad you're there for us. But yeah, I'm happy that they let me do this 2-year project, and it turned out to be really good. So even with all those constraints of local media, and you have to churn, and reporters are expected to do however many stories a day. They let me take off on this, and I was happy with the result.
I mean, as someone that's been enjoying this, like, it was well worth it. I mean, they saw something, you saw something, you pitched it. However, maybe we'll get into that process. Yeah. I actually, so just for basis of an intro for our listeners, can you tell us briefly about yourself and the basics of the series?
Okay, so I'm an interloper from California. I moved to Nashville in 2021, January 7th, 2021. I was on the road when I was listening to the coverage of the January 6th at the Capitol. I've been in newspapers for 40 plus years. I worked at the Orange County Register for most of the time. I took a break in the late 90s to write a screenplay that was made into a Hollywood movie called Showtime with Robert De Niro and Eddie Murphy, a cop buddy movie.
Is that the Keep It Together one?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? I love that movie.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And then I wrote a bank heist screenplay that was made into a movie in 2019 called Finding Steve McQueen with Travis Fimmel and Forrest Whitaker. And so when I came to the Tennessean, this is a long way of getting to where the podcast came from. My boss, Ben Goad, came to me and said, with your screenwriting talent, could you take this long form thing? We don't know really what it is. There was a murder in 1989. We've got police records on it. He handed me an old-fashioned zip drive that I plugged in to the side of my laptop, and it had a bunch of police files in it, and I was just hooked from the beginning. And so the goal was to kind of retell a story about Nashville in a time and place. So I knew I had the murder in my back pocket. That was interesting. But I also wanted to tell the story of how Nashville became the Nashville we know today. And so I wanted to look at country music. I wanted to look at Garth Brooks and Faith Hill and all those people, and how they all rose at the same time that this murder investigation was going on. So it's been 2 years. It was August of 2022 when he handed me that zip drive, and I've been going at it all this time. And what I thought was a retelling didn't turn out to be that way. I started to find out new things that had never been reported about the case, and people opened up to me that had never spoken before. So I was really happy with the way it turned out.
That actually makes a lot of sense. The quality of the podcast is amazing, and so you having that screenwriter background totally makes sense. That checks out, I would say. Absolutely.
Alan, I know you were going to ask him about the drive. I still think that's worth asking, because I feel like there was more to that, I thought.
Well, so you your intro to the show, you say, in 2022, my editor handed me this flash drive. I was wondering how that flash drive happened, but clearly you kind of explained that. But where did that come from? How did the Tennessean happen to have that?
That's a really good question. So my Ben Goad, my boss, knew he has been at the Tennessean for years and had heard about this case and knew, oh my God, this is a podcast. Somehow, some way, this is a podcast. So over the years, he had asked other reporters to go to the police and pull the documents of the case. And there's a police file. And so other reporters back in the teens had gone to Don Aaron at the Metro Nashville Police Department and pulled all the records. So they got the coroner's report, the all the police interviews, the communications between Metro Nashville, the FBI, other states. As you listen, you find out that it's a kind of a expanding story that involves a lot of Georgia and then Nevada, and some other places. And so it was all neatly right there on a drive for me, and he handed it to me, and I just started taking notes. And those reporters, by the way, left the paper or stopped doing the story for some reason, and it was my benefit. I lucked out and got to roll with it.
It's quite the origin story.
I mean, that's quite the theme throughout it too, from the police to just the industry kind of moving on too. So I think we're all very grateful. Everybody who takes the time to start listening to this, which hopefully everybody, I think all our listeners are going to want to get into this after they hear this interview more. But I mean, yeah, really grateful that you got that opportunity too. Let's dive into it. So who was the victim? Maybe talk about that a little bit. What took place?
So Kevin Hughes was a kid from Carmi, Illinois, who had a dream to come to Nashville, but it was different than a lot of people's dreams. He wasn't a guitar player. He wasn't a country singer. He loved music charts, like who's the top 10 this week and how does the top 10 get made. And he was a fan, even as a young kid, of Billboard magazine. So his family told me that his parents would drive him 45 minutes to Evansville, the closest big town, and pick up a Billboard every week. And he would read their charts, and when he disagreed, he would make his own.
Oh, that's
so cool. As a teenager, he was just into music and the business side of music, and so he took a trip to Nashville. He loved Belmont University. He was a Christian kid, and so it seemed to fit. And then one day at school, unfortunately, he saw an advertisement, taped to a wall that said chart research needed, and that it was like a gift from God to him. And he pulled that number and called, and he got hired as a researcher at Cashbox magazine. So Cashbox was an industry trade publication back in the day, and there were a lot of them. And it was generally, regarded probably lowest on the totem pole among the Billboard and Radio and Records and all the other industry trade magazines. But Cashbox ranked songs. And so that's what Kevin Hughes loved to do. And he was kind of living his dream until it all went sour.
Right.
And I think we'll ask you a little bit, because I want to talk about that Cashbox versus Billboard and sort of what happened about that. But before we do, I don't want to spoil anything.
Right. Either do I. And it's really hard not to.
Yeah. And we've been careful with how we have a list of questions, and we've been careful to try to not to. I had thought I had heard you say at some point there was only going to be 8 episodes, but at 7 feels like 8 isn't going to wrap it up. How far is it going?
No, eight's the end.
Okay.
However, since it has dropped, I've gotten a lot of calls from people that have added little bits of information. I would love to do 9. It's costly. You guys know it's a commitment. We've got to hire a freelance sound editor to come in and do it. Somebody's got to edit it. It's I'm not sure if there's going to be an episode 9, but I wish there was.
Okay. Could be a prologue.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Or an epilogue. Yeah.
Yes. Epilogue. Sorry. Yeah.
Season 2. I've even avoided reading articles about this because I just want to hear how it goes. So without spoiling anything, like I said, Chuck Dixon did it, right? Don't answer that. Don't answer that. But I think a better way to approach that is
Okay,
tell the listeners, who is Chuck Dixon? I think
Okay.
eventually we're going to start going through some of the main characters
Yeah.
with intention of keeping it.
So how do I even start? So if Cashbox is the low end of the totem pole among industry trade publications, Chuck Dixon was the low end of the promoter class. He was a guy who, if you came to Nashville from Iowa with an acoustic guitar and a dream, Chuck Dixon was the guy who would whisper in your ear, "I can make you a star. All you've got to do is pay me $5,000 or $10,000, and I'll get you in the studio, and then for another 5 or 10 more, I can get you 45s, and then for another 5 or 10 or 20 more or 50, I can get those songs on the radio and then on the record chart." So Chuck saw himself as the godfather of Nashville independent country music. And he was taking advantage of people. He was promising them big things that would come out of their music career when actually they didn't have a whole lot of talent. So what I say in the podcast is everybody's heard the story of Garth Brooks, who famously came to town for one day, and he was discouraged because nobody would sign him. He thought he was great, and he went back to Oklahoma, and then he finally arrived in Nashville and played gigs all over town. Chuck's people didn't do it that way. Chuck's singers that he represented would make 45s. Chuck would get them played, or would pretend to get them played on the radio. The radio numbers would get charted, and then Kevin Hughes would put out the chart each week and show that so-and-so from Iowa was number 3 this week on the chart. And a lot of times I found it was completely fake.
Oh, records that hadn't even come out yet.
Records that had not been pressed, records that were still, they were still making the labels for the records, records that had never been played on the radio in any market. I found court records from the early 2000s where one of Chuck Dixon's partners said 95% of the songs never had one airplay, and they would end up number 1, number 3, number 11 on the charts. Chuck Dixon had a way of, he would coax someone in by saying, "Oh, this week you're number 87." Then next week they were number 83, then 66. He would move them up, and each time they would congratulate him with bonuses, $500 here, 1,000 there, 2,000 here, and he was just abusing the system for as much as he could, and until people found out that it was a fraud, and then he threatened them, and tried to keep taking them for more money.
I can only imagine that as an aspiring artist, to be able to walk to a newsstand and pick up a magazine and see your name on a chart, regardless of whether it's Cashbox or Cashbox magazine or whatever it is, that would be quite a thing. I mean, you would really.
It's a thrill, right?
Yeah,
especially
and then you start to believe.
Right.
That,
right.
Oh my gosh, I'm hot.
Yes.
How much would you pay to be hot? And that's what he was taking advantage of.
Right.
He went further than that. I found people who would win Singer of the Year. There would be an awards show. There would be an auditorium with people and awards, and they were all fake. It was this system. This, what I call them, say in the podcast, is this underbelly of Nashville, where everybody knew it was going on, and everybody just allowed it to happen. Like, well, that's unfortunate that you got into that lane, because when you get into that lane, it's, you've got a bunch of criminals that you've got to deal with.
You remember, you're a music guy, so you would probably remember this. It's not a song that I wished I remembered, but it played on the radio nonstop in the mid 90s. Do you remember that song Rockabye? Everything's gonna be all right.
Oh, yeah, sure.
There's a line in it where they talk about being in LA and they say it's a lot like Nashville, but with a tan. And I
Oh, yeah,
didn't
they
get
do.
that
You're
for
right.
a long time, but I get that now.
I've heard, as I did reporting on this story, a lot of people compared it to Hollywood, except, I mean, I don't think there's a fake, how do you make a fake movie?
Right.
Yeah.
These people had fake careers. They were just, I interviewed this poor woman, Dawn Dormany, in episode 1 of the podcast, who came to Nashville in a Winnebago with her family. Her father had made his fortune in television repair in Texas. She was 17 years old and thought she was going to be the next big thing, and they got into her. And $250,000 later, she moved back to Texas, and she broke down in tears as she was telling me the story that it was a mind fuck. That's all it was. That she got nothing out of being here. No songs on the radio, no albums, no nothing, but $250,000 taken.
Wow.
Was that the Chuck Dixon "Won't You Lie to Me" lady?
No, that was a different one. I mean, they were all over. I would just, the way I would do some of the reporting was I would get the Cashbox magazine from the weeks around the murder, and I would just start to look up the people's names, and I would find them and then call them, and one after the other, they would just tell me, oh yeah, they were into me for thousands and thousands of dollars.
I've looked at the archives. It is a sleazy looking magazine.
It is.
Alan, I don't think I've let Alan ask a question in a while.
Well, I was going to say, so Dustin and I are kind of huge radio nerds. So like the term payola is not new to us,
right?
But I've never heard it in this sort of version of it.
Right? I hadn't either.
Usually it's like they're giving DJs vacations or taking whining and dining them, like to get them to play a record, things like that. But the way this was working with Cashbox is just a whole different spin on that sort of thing.
Just cut out the middleman. You don't gotta play this. Just tell us.
Just tell them we did it. Yeah.
Right. All you have to do is call in the numbers. But I even found some of the artists, at least one who I talked to, was calling in his own numbers. He would call the radio station and say how many plays, and then it was up to him to call Cashbox magazine to report his own number of plays. And the people I talked to were like, oh my God, that's just like corruption times 20. And there was payola going on because Chuck would grease the DJs. Some of the songs got played sometimes.
You have to have some real.
If Chuck could pull that off. So he was working the DJs like the old-fashioned payola, but he also, the bigger hammer he had was he controlled that chart.
Yeah. It's funny. We have a friend of the show, Mike Bridenstine, does a podcast, and he did a song tournament. He went back to the
original 48, whatever the first year of
the first Billboard, and he did like a March Madness style.
Oh, right.
Where he did like the top 10 songs, and then he would have his guests, pick one. They do a final, whoever won for that year. And there is a marked change when it changes from just people calling the record stores and saying what was your top 5 records you sold this week versus once they actually had a system in place to actually track.
Yeah, there's a name for that. It's called SoundScan, and it came in right around the time that police were investigating this murder. That's why the cultural change in my mind was as important as the crime in the telling of this story, because Garth was exploding and he was the first. I guess Willie Nelson may have played a stadium or two in his early days, but Garth had the swinging from ropes on fire stadium show. Garth was being Queen.
Right. He was a showman.
Yeah. And so Garth was taking it that direction, and then SoundScan came in and proved that Garth was just as popular as Nirvana.
Right.
And when no one would believe that, you ask any kid on the street, they go, oh, well, Nirvana, but you do the actual numbers, not relying on the phone calls to the record stores and the phone calls from radio stations about how many times did you play songs this week. If it was actually computerized, Garth was selling more than all of them. And so then everybody was chasing Garth, and everybody wanted to be the next hot thing. And so Garth and Alan Jackson and Clint Black, and then shortly after Faith Hill, and then Shania Twain, and she changed everything too. So the 1989, it, like quite literally the week of this murder was the first week that Garth dropped a single, and it all changed after that.
Wow.
Alan, do you want to go to this question, or do you want to go back to characters? We can come back to characters, because I feel like this question has more to do with what we're talking about.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that.
Okay, why don't you go?
All right. So, there's a sort of a meta narrative throughout the series where you talk about a song, right? The song that's sort of the namesake of the podcast.
Oh, right. Yeah, love that.
Good song.
Yeah, it's a really good song. And then there's different iterations, different artists that did it, which are pretty incredible throughout the series. I mean, the series is as much about the murder as it is the history of modern country music and sort of the way it's changed. And that song is sort of about that. Can you describe sort of where you came up with using that in that way in the show, how that happened?
Completely by mistake. I mean,
okay.
I completely fucked up, and
sometimes that's the best.
Advantage of that, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So from the very first day, my boss says, "Hey, let's start working on this thing for a podcast." And he goes, "There's a song called Murder on Music Row." I was like, "Oh my God." And so I look it up on Google Lyrics, and I read the lyrics. I'd never heard it before. And it says, "Nobody saw him running from 16th Avenue. Nobody saw found a fingerprint or the weapon that was used." And I go, "Oh, he's writing about."
For the first verse, you're like, this is some murder. Like,
so I call up Larry Cordell and I say, "Hey, I'd like to talk with you about your inspiration and how much did you know about the Kevin Hughes case when you wrote this song?" And he's like, "Nothing. I didn't know anything. What are you talking about?" It didn't inspire us in any way. And I go, "But this detail in the lyrics and this detail," and it was a cold case. It was unsolved for all these years, and it just seemed to line up. So I called his writing partner, Larry Shell. Two Larrys wrote the song, and he's like, "Oh no, we didn't know anything about that murder. They had heard of it, they kind of knew about it, but it was a."
Oh, hey, do us a favor. My internet just went bad for a second.
Okay,
Alan's gone too. So you said you called his writing partner.
Okay.
Yeah, I called up Larry Shell, who was Larry Cordell's writing partner. Two Larrys wrote this song, and he agreed that they had heard of the Murder on Music Row, the Kevin Hughes case, but this was 10 years later. They weren't sitting around talking about, the guy got shot on 16th Avenue South. And I thought, how interesting, because the words illustrate the case so well, and they provide it's the confluence of greed and the chasing of fame and fortune that led to Kevin Hughes's murder. So it seemed like the perfect metaphor, and happened to be called Murder on Music Row. So I thought that would be my cold open. That's what we called it.
Yeah.
It's my cold open every week. Is I start with, this is going on with this song. It also starts off as a little jokey thing. He sings it in the office for me. He doesn't even give the greatest his greatest performance.
Yeah. Which kind of makes it better.
And it grows and grows and grows. And by the end, spoiler alert, it's CMA Song of the Year.
Yeah.
And it is like the hottest story in country music. They're asking everyone, has country music been murdered? Who's the song really about? And so it worked out perfectly. And Larry was a good sport about it. He played the song for us, and he answered all my questions in each episode about it.
Well, let's go back to some of the characters in the story. Just I think the next most important person to set the scene with.
You better get this right.
Yeah. Well, I think the next most would be Sammy Sadler.
You got that right.
Okay.
So
why was he willing to talk to you? and in such candid fashion.
Yeah.
You know, looking back, I would have to say
Just a likable guy.
he for 35 years, Sammy Sadler controlled the narrative of this story.
Mhm.
And I didn't set out with any agenda whatsoever. He could have continued to control the narrative. But every year on the anniversary, I would find a new article from Sammy. I would find a radio interview. I would find People Magazine. I would find Nashville Scene. I would find all. He was a media hound, and I just started to check. He would say things like, "I was shot in the arm, and I had 18 hours of surgery."
Mhm.
And so I thought, man, that sounds like a lot of surgery.
Mhm.
So I called Vanderbilt and I found the physician who did the surgery. And he's like, well, I don't have my notes in front of me, but that kind of surgery is about a 6-hour. Then I found the police report where they interviewed Sammy in his hospital bed at 9:30 in the morning. If he'd been shot at 10:30 at night and he had 18 hours of surgery, it would be 6 o'clock the next evening before they could have interviewed him. But no, there's a report from the cops at his bedside at 9:30 the next morning. And so I just started to think, okay, he may have misremembered the 18 hours. And it did. He said things that I didn't even include in the podcast that I always thought were, he would say, I had 100 staples in my arm.
He got bit by a shark or something?
Yeah, I looked up. He had a saphenous graft, a saphenous vein graft. I looked up that kind of surgery and how far apart the staples are.
Yeah.
And in order for it to be 100, his arm would have had to been 9 feet long, you know?
Right.
And I'm like, okay, it wasn't 100. So he would say a thing, I would check it. And I started to find that some of the things he said were very difficult to verify. Let's put it that way.
They didn't hold up. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think no journalist in 35 years had ever confronted him.
I see.
And so he would walk into a radio station. They didn't know the case. And they go, oh, this poor guy.
I got it.
He got shot. And now he's trying to make a comeback. And isn't this an inspirational story about a guy who would just not give up? And Sammy Sadler's a very nice guy. Aw, shucks. Oh, yes, sir. You know, I'm only here because of the grace of God and all that kind of stuff. Kevin Hughes took a bullet for country music. I'm sorry, Kevin Hughes died for country music, and I took a bullet for it. So he has this persona. And then I just started asking him more difficult questions, and suddenly he couldn't remember anything. Yeah. So Sammy, for people who don't know,
I was going to say, I feel like in our concern of not spoiling anything,
Sammy Sadler was the second victim. He was in the car with Kevin Hughes the night of the shooting. They were out in front of Evergreen Records, and if you drive on 16th Avenue South, it's
almost every day.
Yeah, it's still there. It still looks exactly the same paint job. They probably haven't changed it since 1989. And I have parked in the spot where they parked. I walked the same route that they walked, and it's impossible to reenact the crime in the way Sammy suggested. He was the first person shot. He was shot in the car. He was shot in the kind of between your bicep and your elbow in his right arm. And if you kind of try to figure out how a bullet could get there when you're in the passenger seat of the car, he would have had to turn and put his elbow over his head to prevent a bullet in that way.
And for the listeners, we're talking like sort of lower tricep, barely below the tricep, almost like where it gets to the elbow.
Right. And he, by the way, when he came in our office, I go, hey, will you go out in the hall and take pictures? And he put his arm up like making a muscle, and he pointed exactly. You could still see the scar. He was so cooperative. And then it got to a point in the interview, as you can hear in the podcast, where he suddenly couldn't remember anything, and he disagreed with police reports. I would say, okay, I'm looking at the police report right in front of me, and it says that you called Chuck Dixon and told him that Kevin Hughes was going to drop radio stations, and therefore your song was going to. Sammy was a singer who had a song on the chart the day before Kevin died, and the song was not on the chart that Kevin did on the night he died. So the last thing Kevin did was to take Sammy Sadler's song off the chart. Sammy was represented by Chuck Dixon. Chuck Dixon, police believe, ordered the hit. How did Kevin Hughes get to Evergreen Records? He drove with Sammy Sadler. Why were they there? Because Sammy said he needed to make a phone call, and it just...
Dude, I don't know anybody who's ever called their parents as much as Sammy Sadler.
It's a lot.
Like
at least 5 or 6 times, if you believe, that day. And he said, we were very close. So
it essentially had been decades of softball interviews, and
correct.
So when a journalist gets in there and actually starts asking some questions about the details, suddenly everything falls apart. Essentially,
right. And I've had lunch with the district attorney after the podcast, and he told me, "Gosh, we didn't know all this stuff about Sammy Sadler at the time." So Sammy survived a strong circumstantial case that they chose not to prosecute.
Yeah. You mentioned that you and Sammy became somewhat close.
I mean, I talked to him on the phone. I messaged him all the time because I was checking on dates of this and that, and hey, how can I get a hold of this person or that person, or what song was this? In what order did you sing the songs? And he would message me back. And so we had this kind of Facebook Messenger kind of relationship. And then he came in, brought his fiance, hung out for 4 hours in our office. They were very nice. He answered all the questions, but I think when he walked out, he realized, oh boy.
Do you know if he's heard the podcast? Has he reached out to you?
He has. You might want to go check his Facebook.
Okay, got it.
He has done several
responses.
We have a couple of those. There's a guy that loves commenting on things we post. It's like I never understood when people said they love their haters until you. We don't have to go there. Moving on in the list of characters.
Well, hang on, just before we move on.
Sammy's an interesting one, so we could spend some time here if you'd like.
So Sammy, you talked about his music career. Interestingly, he never really seemed to play gigs, and then talk about how he charted after.
Right.
After the death.
So I think when the district attorney said, we didn't know what you found out about Sammy, I don't think they did research after the murder. So what I did was I kept looking at Cashbox after Kevin Hughes was killed. And I noticed that in the next 3 or 4 months, Sammy's next song charted. Now, remember, Sammy has a bullet in his arm. Still there, by the way. They did not remove the bullet. He couldn't play, couldn't hold a pick, so he couldn't play. He had moved home to Texas. He was no longer calling and promoting his songs to the magazine or to radio stations. So, and he told me when we met, his career was over. But yet, his songs were more popular after Kevin Hughes was gone than they were before when Kevin Hughes was alive. He was nominated for Artist of the Year. He had He was nominated for Song of the Year, a song that he didn't even sing, and which I thought was weird. And I thought, all right, somebody made a mistake and they put the wrong name. But then I found it in two issues of the magazine, the same mistake made in different contexts. So somebody really messed up, or somebody was really trying to reward Sammy. And then the detail that kind of took it over the top for me was the last song was called Mississippi's Burning Tonight, and it was written by Chuck Dixon. I thought, wow, okay. He always said that he barely knew Chuck. And there's a record with he and Chuck working together, and Chuck was his promoter. And so again, it didn't add up. So there was more mentions in the magazine, higher ranked songs, individual awards when Kevin Hughes was gone than before Kevin Hughes was murdered.
Go ahead.
If you're looking for what benefit did Sammy get in that Cashbox world, he kind of rose up.
Right.
And the reason that happened, the mechanisms of how that happened, you get into a lot more details with. So and listeners, if you think that we just explained it, no, there's a whole,
there's a lot.
There's a whole mechanism there that's really fascinating to learn about. Just as an aside, I don't even want to get into it too much. Just wanted to say to you, you were talking about Chuck Dixon getting writing credits. The whole story, was it Chuck Dixon that got the writing credits for The Ride?
Yeah. Do you know that song?
That's a great, of
course.
Yeah, it's a great song.
Yeah, and he had nothing to do, but he knew the person that did it and forced him to do it.
He didn't really do it. That was kind of Chuck. He was kind of like around the edges of things, but he didn't really contribute. Yeah. He went home, and the guy wrote it in this drunken cocaine haze. And I interviewed that guy, Gary Gentry, and he was great, by the way. Loved that guy. And just great storyteller about how he wrote about Hank Williams, and called Chuck in the morning and said, I got a hit song.
Yeah, he held like a seance and everything.
Yeah, a seance. Yeah.
Amazing.
I want to move on to talking about Tony D, but I feel like here's where we really have to start treading lightly.
Yes.
Yeah.
I honestly, I feel I'm best setting this up with, as much as you feel comfortable about, to tease the listeners into it. Who is Tony D? Where would you go with that?
Tony D was a card dealer and pit boss in Las Vegas who moved to Nashville with a young family and couldn't find work. And one day he was playing pinball and ran into the editor of Cashbox magazine, who said, hey, you're pretty good with numbers. Why don't you be our chart director? And hired him, and Tony D became the chart director at Cashbox magazine before Kevin Hughes was there. In fact, Tony D hired Kevin Hughes to replace him because Tony had a bit of a problem. He was a womanizer and a drug dealer and user. And he had a habit of bringing drugs in the office, and he made a lot of people uncomfortable. So they asked him to leave. But he didn't really leave. He kept the key, and he worked closely with Chuck Dixon, and he became a promoter. And so he was one of those guys who would hang out at Shoney's and try to
fucking Shoney's
convince people that they could become this one story I heard that I didn't put in the podcast is they would do it before they even saw anybody play. They didn't even know that they had a guitar or anything. They would walk up to a table and say, I can tell from your speaking voice that you could be a great singer.
Oh my gosh. If
you just listen to my coaching, I can pull this out of you.
Yeah.
And they'd be sitting there with their grandparents and Shoney's, and they'd go, oh my God, I think that too. And so Tony D was one of those guys.
No, so not a lot of Shoney's are still around. Which Shoney's were they talking about? That one by
there was one on Music Row.
There was. Yeah.
So Music Row used to end at the Country Music Hall of Fame. Now it's downtown by Bridgestone Arena. It used to be on 16th Avenue South, and Shoney's was across the street.
Okay. All right. Well, that's not important. You were probably about to say something else.
Yeah. No, that's all right. But Tony D was quite a character, and he was very close with Chuck Dixon.
Yeah, it's one of those shady guys that was sort of in orbit around this.
Yeah, he was in orbit around. Yes.
Yeah.
And honestly, for the sake of the story, I think we should leave it there.
Yes.
Talking about Tony D. But guys, when you listen to oh boy, you're going to listen to the first few up. Not hearing a lot about this Tony D guy. You just wait. Do you want to talk about Steve Daniel?
Sure.
I find it ironic that the GBI ended up using him and churning him out just as much as the industry churned out all the other artists.
It just incredible. The whole Steve Daniel, like the fissure of the Steve Daniel part of this story, is amazing. Who Steve Daniel's from Flintstone, Georgia. It sounds like a made up, like, hey, let's make up a crazy way that this story's going to end. And let's set it in Flintstone, Georgia. Steve Daniel was a drug dealer who knew
Tony,
who had connections to Nashville.
Right.
And he was. I interviewed. Did you guys like the two girls who lived in the house?
Yes.
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 Where Steve Daniel was the landlord.
Yeah, there's that one room we can't get into.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the FBI cameras were set up
Right.
in the laundry room of the house, and there was a bullet hole in the dining room window.
You might want to look into that.
Yeah, you might. She tells me that. Yeah, you might want to look into that. So I did. Yeah, and the cops did too. And the biggest, I think it's Walker County, the biggest drug bust in the history of Walker County, Georgia, took place at that house, and Steve Daniel was a drug dealer for the Mexican cartel.
Right.
And a very nice guy who was a landlord for these two little girls and their mom. And he had a connection to Nashville, and he needed to get off of that drug charge.
We should leave it.
I think we can say it. Yeah.
I feel like we've set up a lot of the characters just fine for people to be interested in hearing more of the series. Do you want to get back to talking about the music industry and some?
Sure. I'll go where you want to go.
Well, Alan, you've let me ask all I want.
So I get the impression from listening to the pod that you are definitely a music fan, somebody who likes music.
Yes.
And this really kind of exposes kind of the seedy underbelly of the music industry. I think, we're not naive. We kind of know some of that exists. But as a music fan, how did you process or feel about that?
Well, it struck me that, I'm a dreamer too.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote screenplays on spec in Hollywood and wanted to hit it big. That's what's the difference between writing a screenplay and writing what you think is a hit song or a hit album.
Sure.
And so when I talked to Bobby Braddock, a songwriter, or Tony Arata, or Trey Bruce, or people who had success, I believe in Nashville still. I believe that you can come here. If you're in Colorado, you can't name a hit song that came from Colorado. But if you somehow could bring your acoustic guitar to Nashville and get it played in the right place at the right time with the right people hearing it, I believe in that dream.
I'm not going to let you sit here and short sell Boulder, Colorado, 303 from the early mid 2000s.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. Let me use Montgomery, Alabama. I don't know, any other place.
No, point taken. Yeah.
So I love the Faith Hill story, and she played as a teenager in a prison, and she was a backup singer for
tied to this case.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And she was a witness. She was on the street. She had blood on her shoes.
Jeez.
Yeah, and it's too bad. I had many exchanges with her people, trying to get her interested in talking to me, and they said that they had discussed it with her, and she chose not to. It's probably a very traumatic point in her life, seeing she was a witness to a brutal murder. And
understandable.
Yeah, understandable. But, she got discovered at the Bluebird Cafe singing backup. And they said, no, we don't want you. We want her.
Yeah.
From the back.
Yeah.
And so I love the myths of country music. But then I started to do the math in my head, and it was easy to come to the conclusion that there are more people like Sammy Sadler and Don Dormany and the woman who sang Lie to Me, Chuck Dixon on the phone than there were Faith Hill and Garth Brooks and those guys.
And it's not like in pro sports where it's like, things just don't break your way. It's people are lying to you and promising you the whole way.
Right. Yeah. And that's a business.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, my podcast is about Chuck Dixon and Tony D and Robert Metzger and other like shady dudes. The list goes on and on. There were, for every good promoter, there were 3 not good promoters. And so it started to get disheartening. I interviewed Bill Pridemore, the lead detective on the case, and he just laid it out so perfectly. He was like, I went into this having a lot of respect for country music, and when I left, I had no respect for any person in the business at all. I loved talking to Tony Brown, who was the president of MCA Records, about how, he thought Dwight Yoakam sang through his nose, and so he didnn't want to. I
never noticed that until I heard that. I was like, of course, right. I hear it now. Yeah.
Yes, and now every time I hear a Dwight Yoakam song, I think about that.
Good.
And the his dinner table session with Garth Brooks, where he told him he was full of shit, and all that stuff. Those stories are great. But then there are these other people, these hangers-on, these desperate people, not only on the talent side, but on the fake independent music scene side. And that kind of, I guess I was a little bit shocked that it would be so built into the, it's just a thing you've got to deal with when you come here. There's going to be the first wave of people you're going to see are the people who are going to steal you blind.
Yeah.
And then they may shoot you. And then if you get past those people, then you might get to the people who signed Garth Brooks.
Right.
Crazy.
Yeah. It's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone today, and I was telling him that we were going to interview you later. And so I kind of gave him sort of broad strokes of the story. And I was like, this was back in the 80s and 90s when things like this could be manipulated. And he kind of laughed, and he's like, well, I'm sure they'll figure out a way to do that currently as well. And I was like, yeah, you know what? You're probably right. I mean, you can't manipulate Spotify plays, but I'm sure there's weasels still, right?
So I thought, so you asked me earlier about doing a next episode. I always thought that people would come forward. But now that I've released the whole podcast, episode 8 is going to drop tomorrow, by the way.
Okay. I was going to say this will probably come out after or right around episode 8. So this will release next Thursday. But
okay. I always thought that episode 9 was going to be about new people who came forward and said they had been taken for all their worth. But the more I thought about it, and the more I talked to people who listened, many artists have called me, like people who play the smaller clubs. They're the ones that this is speaking to, who've had to run this gauntlet of promoters. They don't want to tell their story because what you'd have to say is my talent wasn't great enough to get me the deal that Garth got, but I was kind of good. And then they lied to me and they told me I paid my way. Nobody's going to admit that they kind of joined the scam.
Right.
Because even that's not entirely true, because a lot of the people that are at the top of this, frankly, aren't that good compared to
well, true.
Those.
I'm just But what I'm saying is the people who have contacted me don't want to admit they play a role in this whole underbelly game.
Right.
Because they're the ones who come up with the $5,000 or the $10,000, and they'll pay to get their song with the shady radio station that doesn't really play their records. They know what's going on.
They keep the wheel spinning, essentially.
Except Sammy Sadler, who said he had never heard of any of this.
Nope.
Didn't
It's
know.
amazing that all these things that cost you hundreds of dollars to have ads in there just got done for free from you. But
I don't know what happened.
Never paid a dime.
And the thing that's really disappointing, and honestly, like it hits you in the feels, is that if I could be a little philosophical here, there's hope and fear exist on opposite sides of the spectrum, but they are antipodal to each other for a reason. And when you strike out to create something and be something, expressing your talent and being so vulnerable, that comes with fear, but you're tapping into a hope, which is the positive aspect. And these people are just destroying that. And it's just so vile.
It's vile. Yeah. That's why I kept saying in the podcast that it was pure evil in country music. And, this is supposed to be 3 chords and the truth. And this is supposed to be, God and trucks and mama and all that stuff.
Trains and prison.
Well, yeah, true. Yeah.
A friend of mine named Ben Goodman wrote that song.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're selling the dream that people want to buy, unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Did you have a favorite interview from the series? Or you've said a few?
Well, I mean, I loved finding the girls who lived in the house where the drug bust took place, and the case of Murder on Music Row turned because of that house. That was incredible. It was just it was hard to find them, and I did, and then they both cooperated. So it
really gave the story a third act, right? Like
yeah. But and the person we haven't.
Okay, all right.
Oh, there's a good one.
I know.
There's a good one, and her name is Beth Watts, and she's a singer who really couldn't sing, and I found her, and oh boy, that was great too. Case couldn't have happened without Beth Watts.
Oh, she was the one you hinted at episode 6, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And she's in episode 7.
Right.
Just wait.
Okay.
There's a major twist in episode 7.
That's right, because someone got a little handsy, and that was
yeah. You got it. You got it.
I really liked your interview with Mark Carman. It wasn't really anything that wasn't said already, but the way he shared with you was really touching. About I'm going to do it less eloquently than him, but the whores and pimps and cattle milk dry and the industry just churning you through.
Well, he talked about Keith Whitley, and Keith Whitley happened, the death of Keith Whitley, who drank himself to death in May of 1989. It was, one reason why I say 1989 was the biggest year in the history of country music. Taylor Swift was born in 1989. Keith Whitley died in 1989, and Garth Brooks, launched in 89. But when Mark Carman talked about the industry, when Keith Whitley died, the industry didn't slow down.
Right.
They just started plotting his posthumous albums. There's 10,000 more of those people to choose from, and I thought that was very touching. Another interview that I really loved was Trey Bruce, who talked about Shania Twain and her like monumental change to the music industry. But it was Mutt Lange, but she was open to his suggestions about how he could change her career, and I thought that really made the second half of the podcast.
Oh, I got to agree with you there, because that was the point in the series where I just rolled my eyes. I'm like, we're gonna fucking talk about Shania Twain. Like, I understand it in the context of how music changed at that time period, but when he started talking about, it's not just stacking the fiddles, but getting 5 different fiddle players, and technique, and he described the technique in a way I was like, I see,
and now I hear it. Now I go, that kick drum. He goes, we used to just put a pillow in the kick drum.
You think I didn't? I went to a show at the Ryman that night after I heard that episode, and I looked at that kick drum. I'm like, I wonder what's in there.
Right, exactly. So, interviewing Tony Arata, another one of my favorites. So, I didn't know when I started how much of me should be in the podcast. Right? I've got a murder story. I've got the story of Nashville. I've got all of these things to tell. And Tony Arata is the guy who wrote the song "The Dance," and "The Dance" is one of my favorites. And as you can probably tell, I'm a sentimental guy, and that song always gets a tear in my eye when I hear that song. I think of my wife. I think of my kids. Oh my gosh. I'm glad that we didn't know how this was going to come out, you know? So I asked Tony Arata about how he came up with The Dance, and he told me about Peggy Sue Got Married, the movie, the Francis Ford Coppola movie. And so I thought, I'm going to watch that movie.
That's right.
With Kathleen Turner and Nicolas Cage. It's a time travel movie, and it was a Sunday morning, and I rented it, and I started watching it because I wanted to get the moment that he said when the children's pictures start to disappear from Kathleen Turner's locket. It was so moving to him that he got that line, "Life's better left to chance. I could have missed the pain, but I would have missed the dance." And I'm watching, and I called to my wife, and I go, "Nancy, there's no locket. There's no pictures of kids. What's going on?"
Yeah.
So I looked up vanishing kids, and it was Back to the Future.
Of course, right.
He had
mixed
put
the
two
memories.
movies together, and that's what
and made that
motivated him to write this touching song. And so I just loved talking about that story with him, and he was laughing about it. We had a good time. But
yeah, that was a really cool interview.
It had nothing to do with the murder, but
yeah.
Well, in terms of Garth, I was more of a fan of "Mama's in the Graveyard, Papa's in the Pen." That was
exactly
Garth songs. I loved that song. For years, I thought he was saying he never hit the brakes while he was shifting gears. I'm like, that doesn't even make sense. Who does that? But he never hit the brakes and he was shifting gears. But now
how did he get away with that song? That's
that doesn't quite fit the other Garth songs too.
No, it does not.
Yeah.
What was that term that guy had for when two mules work together?
They jihad.
Jihad, yeah. I was like, what is that? And then you explain it. But
okay, when I talked to him, he looked at me like I was the biggest idiot in the world. I was like, "Hey, excuse me, what did you just say?" And he said, "Well, we jihad." Like, of course, everybody knows what jihad means.
Like a religious damn it, Alan, what am I trying? I'm trying to say jihad. Never mind.
Oh,
no, not that jihad. Jihad, like hee-haw, but with a G.
Yes. Right.
It's when two donkeys work in tandem. And I looked it up, and that makes sense to what he was saying. He was the lead detective, and he had a partner, and they jihad.
They worked well together, yeah.
But then there was the other cop, also interesting, who found the key, led him down this whole rabbit hole of this other guy who may have mistaken Kevin Hughes for another guy, and they didn't jihad. And by the time we got to that story, I knew what jihad meant. So I knew that he didn't get along with that second cop who did that other investigation.
Right.
Is this your favorite project?
Oh, yeah. I mean, sure, I loved doing the screenplays that I did. I've done I do a lot of long form journalism.
Yes, so do we. Our episodes are way too long. My wife's always giving me a hard time.
Right, you understand that. But so this, spoiler alert, maybe I'm giving you a little too much information, but we've been in touch with some movie companies. And
cool.
Yeah, and so I have big dreams that this. I mean, think about it. Yeah. Nashville, it's so colorful. It's tragic.
Oh, yeah.
It's got Garth and Faith and Willie Nelson and it's got a terrible murder of a good solid human being who got killed because he had integrity.
Yep.
And it reveals something about us.
Yeah.
I say in there, I was just moved at one point. I remember I just kind of ripped this line that we're all guilty when we let little corruption happen around us. Yeah. And it seemed to me like you could explain all this as little corruption.
Yeah.
That, hey, I'll make you a star when I really can't. And I'll get you your song played on the radio when I really can't. And you're really the singer of the year when you really aren't. And we all kind of allow that to happen. And everybody knew. I say in the podcast that everybody who read Cashbox magazine knew that it was all corrupt.
Yeah.
it was their job to know every inch of who was charting and who was not. And there would be 5 other charts with all the same names on them, except Cashbox had 3 or 4 every week that were weird as hell.
Yeah.
And the guy Tony Alamo, whose wife died and he kept her body in a casket with a glass cover because she was going to be resurrected. Yeah. He had a song on the chart, and nobody could explain. Well, he paid money,
right?
And everybody knew.
And I mean, sometimes they were even charted above actual, like, real famous artists.
Yeah.
It was like
Sammy Sadler. I would just, if you do a search of his name in Cashbox, he's ahead of Dwight Yoakam and the Judds, and in some cases,
Yeah, that's incredible. I was thinking, I was listening to some podcasts, and a lot of print journalism now puts out podcasts. The New York Times. I think I listened to 3 New York Times podcasts.
They bought Serial.
Yeah. So, do you think podcasts?
The original podcast, Serial, the first
the original,
podcast ever.
Yeah.
Do you think podcasts can save the print news industry?
Well, I'll tell you what it can do. It can open up a revenue stream that that wasn't there before. So if we sell the rights, there are documentary rights and there are scripted rights, and if we could develop that, it would be incredible. People, I think, are accustomed to paying, like you found out, not as many as you would hope, but for this kind of content, because of the way the internet exploded in the late 90s or mid 90s or whenever it did, people got unaccustomed to paying for news.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly there's this thing that people will pay for, and you can sell sponsorships, you can sell subscriptions, and we did a big subscription drive on this one, and got a lot of subscriptions. So it opens up some avenues that print journalism is now looking at. It's a lot, though, to take me away. I mean, I wasn't away from the newsroom. I still covered stories and things, but I had another focus for 2 years.
Yeah. What's next for you? I mean, you said the movie thing, but do you have another project you're working on?
Oh yeah, I got a good one.
Oh
well,
nice.
So I want to do. I think that the niche that we found was the confluence of music and crime, and I think there are a couple of cases in Nashville's history in which those two intersect.
No. More than one? Come on, get out of town. Yeah.
No spoilers here, but I'll be looking at those
so you're a true crime report. You're a true crime podcaster now.
Yeah, I know.
That, man.
I know. I want to be.
I look forward to hearing more.
Dude, hey, wait, hold on. I said that flippantly, but me and my wife were talking about it. We're like, this is as good as all the. My wife listens to nothing but true crime and my show, which God bless her for taking the time. But it's been in our rotation with all of her Crime Junkie and the prosecutors and all of those true crime shows she loves.
Great.
My favorite murder. All that. Yeah.
Let's hope every single one of your listeners and all your wife's friends listen to this.
Yes,
bad boy.
Absolutely.
I can't imagine they won't. I'm aware of the time. We didn't really say so, but we probably were both assuming this will be about an hour. So I don't want to take too much more of your time, but as long as I have you,
sure.
I've got a couple of nagging questions.
Sure.
Where was the Captain D's on West End? I work in that area all the time. I've been to the building, the Cashbox building. What it's not anymore, but
right.
I've been there.
Have you driven the route?
Yes. Well, I mean, I have by chance at work, but I've also driven all those streets. So I looked at it on a map when you described it. I was like, oh yeah, okay, I see all that. But the Captain D's not there anymore. Is it past the McDonald's?
It is. So do you know where Bricktops is?
Yes.
So I said in the pod, now I may be admitting a slight mistake here.
Okay.
I said in the podcast that it was literally where Bricktops is today.
Oh, I missed that. Okay.
And a listener contacted me and said she used to work there and it was across the street.
Okay.
So there's a Starbucks there's a Starbucks and a Brick Tops across the street from each other. It's either one on either side of West End.
Can I just ask you another question? This is a personal question.
Sure.
I'm not going to give away my day job, but I think the listeners know it. I've worked inside of a Captain D's before.
Yeah.
Would you ever eat fast food, seafood? I've never understood the.
You know what? I eat like a fifth grader.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I would.
I
would eat there happily.
Yeah. Don't besmirch the good name of a Tennessee original. I don't mean to.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but wait a minute. Bringing it all back home, would you eat at Captain D's on the night of your deadline when you had to put the chart out? When everybody knew that you stayed in the office all hours to work on the music chart, would you leave to go to Captain D's? That's the question.
Yeah. So
that seems unlikely.
Sammy convinced him to do.
Yeah, correct.
And make several phone calls along the way.
Correct.
Right. Guys, you got to listen to this series. We do have a couple of traditional things that we like to end our show with. Whenever we have a guest, one is, what's the dumbest thing you've ever done? It's the same response every time.
Yeah, doing this show. That's signing up to do this. Oh boy, I don't know.
It doesn't have to be the dumbest. Just the first one you think of. If it's any consolation, mine's probably pooping in my wetsuit, and I have never got the chance to tell.
Oh, do you say that every time to get the person?
Whenever people really feel like they don't like sharing, I'm like, come on, mine's crapping in my wetsuit. It can't be worse than that.
Okay, so the real talent of this of being the guest on this end is to take every question and spin it to make it look like I'm answering, but not really answer. So listen to this one. When Showtime opened in 2003 at the Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard with Robert De Niro and Eddie Murphy and Will Smith, who was a producer there, and other Hollywood stars, and 1,000 people, and a red carpet and photographers like you would believe. I'm walking down the red carpet because my movie is opening, and they're asking me, "Who are you?" And my wife and I are arm in arm, and this is the greatest moment of our life. And we go in the theater and we sit down, and we're first. I was there early.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, oh man, Nancy, that was the greatest moment of our lives.
No,
let's do that again. So we walked out the side exit of the theater, walked back around the front of the theater, and walked down the aisle again to have everyone go, "Who are you?" and all that stuff. So we walked down the red carpet twice. That's what I thought of when you said, "What's the dumbest?"
I thought you were going to say telling your wife that was the best day of your life. I'm like, oh no.
That's dumb right there. But,
Alan, do you want to ask him just for the traditional?
Yeah. So we always we preface every one of our shows with a little bumper. So we ask our guest to kind of record something for us. It's kind of self-deprecating. So just be like, I'm Keith Sharon from the Murder on Music Row podcast and the Tennessean, and I never listened to None Taken. Like that.
Okay. Yeah, but try to be genuine. Make you've never listened.
Like you really haven't listened.
Okay. Do I have to say those words, or can I explain?
No, as long as it ends with, and I never listened to None Taken.
Okay.
Yes.
Hey, everybody. I'm Keith Sharon with Murder on Music Row podcast. And I heard about this podcast, but I swear to God, I have never listened to, what's it called?
None Taken.
None Taken. None Taken.
Perfect.
That's perfect. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, man.
All right. Thanks, guys. It was very fun. I can't wait for it. Next Thursday, right?
Next Thursday it'll come out. We'll have it on the Patreon immediately, but we'll put it on our feed next Thursday.
All right. Thank you.
Cheers, man.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.
Well, that was fun.